Today we're going to dismantle a persistent question for this class. Where do you end and where does the machine begin? When you hear the word cyborg, what do you see? Arnold Schwarzenegger in a leather jacket, RoboCop, the most underappreciated member of the Justice League? Pop culture has trained us to see the cyborg as a weapon, a tank made of flesh and steel. But today we're going to look past the Hollywood explosions to find the philosophical heart of the cyborg. We're going to trace the history of this idea from a 1960s space lab to the pages of Japanese manga and the Afrofuturist funk of Janelle Monáe. Our goal is to understand how the cyborg challenges our traditional definitions of humanity. We will see how this figure helps us navigate a globalized technological world where the lines between nature and culture aren't just blurred, they're deleted. Let's start with the origin story. You might remember that in our discussion of sentience, we defined the cyborg as a cybernetic organism, a system where biological and mechanical parts share a feedback loop. But where did that idea actually come from? The answer isn't science fiction. It's a 1960 paper by two scientists named Manfred Clynes and Nathan Kline, titled Cyborgs in Space. Their problem was practical. Space is lethal to humans. We need oxygen, gravity, and specific temperatures. Instead of building massive, heavy environments to mimic Earth, like the spaceships we see in movies, Clynes and Kline asked a radical question: why not alter the human to fit the environment? They proposed cybernetic organisms, cyborgs. These would be humans with integrated mechanical systems that would automatically take care of the body's needs, regulating blood pressure, injecting drugs to handle radiation, or controlling heart rates, without the astronaut even thinking about it. The first actual cyborg wasn't a super soldier. It was a white laboratory rat in the 1950s with an osmotic pump implanted in its body. This pump allowed for a continuous automatic injection of chemicals, creating a new artificial control loop within the animal. It was a cybernetic loop, a self-regulated system, much like a thermostat. The goal here was homeostasis, keeping the system stable. The rat's body and the pump were no longer two separate things. They had become one self-regulating system, the same kind of feedback loop between organism and machine that Norbert Wiener was theorizing about when he coined the word cybernetics in the first place. But here's what makes this more than an interesting piece of history. As the philosopher Andy Clark points out in his essay, Cyborgs Unplugged, if a cyborg is simply a merger of flesh and machine through a feedback loop, then that definition leads us to a startling conclusion. You don't need surgery to be a cyborg. Clark argues that humans are natural-born cyborgs. We have always used tools to extend our minds and bodies. Whether it's a pair of glasses that alters your visual perception or a smartphone that stores your memory, we are constantly plugging into non-biological systems to function. Consider the philosopher Don Eads' concept of technologically mediated vision. When Galileo looked up through his telescope, he didn't just see the moon better. The technology fundamentally changed what the moon was to the human mind. It shifted from a celestial orb to a geological object with mountains. The tool changed the human experience of reality. So the cyborg isn't just about metal arms or osmotic pumps. Clark is telling us something much bigger. The feedback loop between organism and technology isn't something new. It's what we've always been. The question isn't whether you're a cyborg, it's how deep the loop goes. The cyborg is a survival strategy, a way of adapting to an environment that would otherwise destroy you. Clynes and Kline were thinking about outer space, but in 1985, a philosopher named Donna Haraway asked a much bigger question. What if the hostile environment isn't space? What if it's the entire structure of how Western thought organizes the world? Haraway wasn't writing about rats or astronauts. She was writing about feminism and socialism, and she saw a problem. Western thought, philosophy, science, politics is built on a set of rigid dualisms, binaries, categories that divide the world into two opposing sides, male and female, nature and culture, human and machine, civilized and primitive. These binaries aren't neutral, they're hierarchical. One side is always the default, the norm, the standard. The other side is the deviation, the lack, the thing defined by what it isn't. The philosopher Jacques Derrida argued that this privileging of one term over another is a form of violence. The slash mark itself, civilized/primitive, human/machine, denotes that violence. It marks the site where power decides who gets to be the norm and who gets pushed to the margins. Think about human versus machine. Human is the center. Machine is what you measure against it. And remember what we saw in our very first lecture. Cyberpunk puts the body itself on the battleground between these two categories. The body becomes the site where human and machine collide. Haraway's insight is that this collision doesn't just happen in cyberpunk fiction. It's happening in real life, right now, and the binaries we rely on to make sense of it are already breaking down. Her solution? A myth, specifically a, quote, blasphemous myth, one designed to be uncomfortable, to violate the sacred categories Western thought depends on. That myth is the cyborg. Haraway argues that the cyborg is useful precisely because it doesn't fit into any of these binaries cleanly. It is not born of a mother and father, so it doesn't have an Oedipal complex. It has no origin myth to return to. There is no natural state to restore. It is illegitimate. As Haraway writes, the main trouble with cyborgs is that they are illegitimate, offspring of militarism and patriarchal capitalism. But illegitimate offspring are often exceedingly unfaithful to their origins. To understand why Haraway chose this particular figure, you need a bit of context. In the 1970s and 80s, feminism was in crisis. The political category women, the idea that all women shared a common experience of oppression that could unite, was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Women of color, working class women, lesbian women all pointed out that their experiences of oppression were fundamentally different from those of white, middle-class, heterosexual women. There was no single women's experience. The cyborg, for Haraway, wasn't a replacement for that category. It was a way of dissolving the need for it entirely. If identity isn't fixed, if we're all already hybrid, already assembled from parts, then we can build solidarity without pretending everyone's situation is the same. Haraway identifies 3 specific boundaries where this breakdown is most productive. 3 places where the cyborg reveals that our categories were never as solid as we thought. The first is the boundary between organism and machine. By the late 20th century, machines had become eerily lifelike. They regulate, they respond, they adapt. And organisms, us, had become eerily machine-like. We regulate our bodies with pills. We extend our senses with devices. We outsource our memory to phones. The line between the two wasn't disappearing. It had never been as clear as we pretended. The second is the boundary between the physical and the non-physical. Remember our lecture on sentience. N. Catherine Hales described the moment when information lost its body, when the pattern came to be seen as separate from the substrate carrying it. Haraway is pointing to exactly that separation as a site where our categories break down. We used to think that solid, material things were fundamentally different from information, from data, from patterns. But simulation can now reproduce physical experience so convincingly that the distinction starts to dissolve. You can feel something in a virtual environment. The physical and the digital are no longer opposites. They're different registers of the same thing. We saw this in Neuromancer. Case's cyberspace wasn't a pale imitation of reality. It was a more intense version of it. The third is the boundary between nature and culture. We like to think there's a natural world out there, untouched by human influence, and a cultural world where we build on top of it. But Haraway points out that nature itself is a cultural construction, a story we tell ourselves about what exists outside of human meaning-making. There is no outside. Everything is already shaped by the systems we live in. This is why Haraway argues that we are cyborgs, not metaphorically, but structurally. We live, she says, in the informatics of domination, a world where our identities are coded, disassembled, and reassembled by technology, economics, and politics. The boundaries that were supposed to protect us, human versus machine, nature versus culture, have become the very systems through which power operates. But here is where Haraway does something unexpected. Instead of mourning the loss of these boundaries, she celebrates it. If the old categories are broken, she argues, then the old way of claiming knowledge is broken too. For centuries, Western thought has privileged a single, supposedly objective perspective, a view from nowhere, a God's eye view that claims to see everything all at once. Haraway calls this a fantasy. Real knowledge, she argues, is always situated. It comes from a specific place, a specific body, a specific position in the world. Partial perspectives aren't a weakness. They're actually more honest than the pretense of total objectivity. This idea that knowledge is always positioned, always coming from somewhere, will become very important when we think about whose futures get imagined in cyberpunk and whose get left out. And politically, the broken boundaries open up new possibilities. If we are cyborgs, we aren't tied to biological determinism. We don't have to be women or men in the traditional sense. The cyborg offers a way to imagine a post-gender world. It allows for what Haraway calls, quote, pleasure in the confusion of boundaries. This is the philosophical core of the manifesto. The cyborg is a tool to reject, quote, holism, the idea of a perfect natural whole, and embrace, quote, partiality and, quote, connection. Now let's see what that looks like when it hits the page of one of the most important cyberpunk texts we'll read this semester. Major Motoko Kusanagi is exactly the kind of figure Haraway was imagining, and exactly the kind of figure Berdadi later described as the post-human subject. Relational, processual, never finished. She is the protagonist of Ghost in the Shell, and she is a full-body cyborg. Her shell, her body, is government property, mass-produced and replaceable. Her ghost, her consciousness, is the only thing that makes her unique. And that distinction, ghost versus shell, pattern versus substrate, is one of the deepest questions in the manga. Ghost in the Shell is a perfect illustration of what Haraway calls the leaky distinctions between physical and non-physical. But it's doing something even more provocative. It's asking whether consciousness, the ghost, can exist independently of the body that carries it. If the ghost is just a pattern of information, and the shell is just hardware running it, then the major isn't really one person. She's a pattern that could, in theory, be copied, transferred, or run on a different system entirely. If her body is just parts, and her brain is cybernetic, is she human? The work challenges the traditional definition of consciousness. In the series, you'll also meet the Puppet Master, an AI born from the sea of information who claims to be a living entity. This will force us to ask, is consciousness biological, or is it just complex data processing? However, we must also apply a critical lens. Haraway hoped the cyborg would lead to a world without gender. But as critics have noted, in Ghost in the Shell, the major's body is hypersexualized. She is a weapon, yes, but she is designed to look like a, quote, perfect woman. This is exactly what we discussed in our last lecture. Technology is never neutral. It carries the values, priorities, and power structures of those who create and control it. The major's body reflects the tension Haraway warned about. Technology can liberate us, but it is often produced by the very systems we are trying to escape: patriarchy, militarism, the male gaze. Everything we've discussed so far, Clynes and Kline, Haraway, even Kusanagi, has been shaped by a particular tradition, Western, primarily European intellectual history. In our discussion of disembodiment and erasure, we asked whose future is being programmed and whose knowledge gets to count. That question becomes urgent here because Janelle Monáe's The ArchAndroid imagines a cyborg from a perspective that tradition has consistently excluded, and it does something Haraway's framework alone can't do. It grounds the cyborg in a specific history of bodily oppression. For the concept album, Monáe adopts the persona of Cindy Mayweather, an android, specifically number 57821, in a futuristic metropolis. In this world, androids are the other. They are used for labor and entertainment, but are socially segregated and forbidden from loving humans. Now, technically, an android is not the same as a cyborg. A cyborg is a biological organism enhanced or merged with mechanical parts, like Major Kusanagi, whose human brain is housed in a manufactured body, or even the laboratory rat with the osmotic heart pump. An android, by contrast, is entirely artificial, a synthetic being designed to resemble a human. But Haraway's theoretical framework applies to both, because both blur the human-machine boundary in ways that destabilize our categories. What matters isn't the technical distinction, it's that both figures challenge the idea that human is a fixed natural category. Monáe is working within Afrofuturism here, a complex cultural movement that you may already be familiar with. The critic Ytasha Womack defines Afrofuturism as, quote, an intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation. It's a cultural, aesthetic, and philosophical approach that combines science fiction, history, and fantasy to center the African diaspora experience. Afrofuturist artists ask, what does the future look like when Black people are not erased from it? What technologies of liberation become possible when we imagine from perspectives the dominant culture has marginalized? The android in Monáe's work serves as a metaphor for the history of slavery and the othering of Black bodies. Like the historical enslaved person, the android is considered property, a machine for labor. And this is where Monáe's cyborg diverges sharply from the ones we've seen so far. Think about what escape the body means when your body has been the target, when enslaved people were treated as machines, as property, as labor. The idea that technology could free you by letting you leave the flesh behind isn't liberation. It's another erasure. Remember that the decolonial theorist Walter Mignolo calls this the difference between ego politics of knowledge, the Enlightenment tradition that sees the body as a limitation, and body politics of knowledge, where the body is the site of memory, history, and resistance. Monáe refuses the ego politics move. The android body in the ArchAndroid isn't something to be left behind. It's something to be claimed. Monáe has, with respect to Winter, flipped the script. Cindy Mayweather is the ArchAndroid, a messianic figure sent to free her people. In her manifesto, Haraway said the cyborg, quote, would not recognize the Garden of Eden. Cindy Mayweather doesn't want to go back to some pre-technological paradise. She wants to break down what Monáe calls the Great Divide, the separation between human and machine, self and other. And in doing so, she challenges what counts as authentic experience. In her songs, the android feels love, fear, and desire more intensely than the humans who oppress her. Feeling isn't a human privilege, it's a boundary waiting to be dissolved. This connects directly to Haraway's idea of oppositional consciousness. The cyborg, or android, gains power because it exists on the boundaries. By claiming the identity of the machine, Monáe reclaims agency. She turns the tool of oppression, the technological body, into a tool of liberation. So what have we learned? Historically, the cyborg began as a scientific solution to environmental hostility, a way to survive in space. Philosophically, Donna Haraway taught us that the cyborg is a way to survive here on Earth, by rejecting the rigid boxes of gender, race, and nature. Culturally, works like Ghost in the Shell and the ArchAndroid show us that these questions are not settled. They are active battlegrounds where we define who gets to be, quote, human. As we wrap up this lecture, consider your smartphone. Consider how you curate your online identity. Consider the medical technologies keeping your loved ones alive. Haraway wrote, quote, "By the late 20th century, our time, a mythic time, we are all chimeras, theorized and fabricated hybrids of machine and organism. In short, we are cyborgs." The question isn't whether you will become a cyborg. You already are one. The question is, what kind of cyborg will you be?